Press to talk. Committee on Housing and Insurance will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled the Public Housing Authority Oversight, How Scandals and Mismanagement Harm Residents and Taxpayers. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chairman for inclusion in the record. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Today's hearing is about a familiar topic, the ongoing challenges of providing housing to our constituents. That has frequently been explored in our previous 8 housing hearings. But today we will look at the problem from a different angle. As you can tell from its titles, PHA Oversight, How Scandals and Mismanagement Harm Residents and Taxpayers, today's hearing will focus on why so many local housing agencies fail to do the job we pay them to do, namely competently running our federal housing programs. This not only hurts residents and wastes taxpayer resources, it is also an actual violation of federal law, which requires, it doesn't suggest or aspire to, it doesn't just encourage, but it actually requires public housing authorities to provide, quote, decent, safe, and sanitary housing. That's the obligation. But instead of successes, too often we get horrible stories about incompetence, mismanagement, and overt criminal fraud. Some recent headlines from the Washington Post, quote, DC overpays landlords millions to house the city's poorest from February 2023. DC residents face long housing aid delays as 3,100 vouchers sit unused from October 2023. Or how about this from the press of Atlantic City? Quote, Atlantic City Housing Authority still struggles with heat in November of 2023. Or, quote, public housing tenants beg City Council for action on Atlantic City Housing Authority from December 2023. And elsewhere, quote, FBI searches the office of nonprofits connected to Little Rock Housing Authority from the Arkansas Times in January 2024. Quote, corruption, sewage, apathy, a federal watchdog on what he saw at NYCHA, the New York Public Housing Authority, from the New York Times in March of 2024, or who could forget this from the New York Post, quote, 70 current and ex-NYCHA workers, New York Public Housing Authority workers, cuffed in historic decade-long $2 million bribery and extortion bust from February 2024. I believe that is the largest ever bust for bribery in the history of our country. These troubling reports all seem to have a few things in common. First, they all involve well-known public housing agencies in prominent places like Washington, D.C., Atlantic City, and other places, but it happens in small towns. I talked to a mayor in Toledo who's dealing with the same kinds of problems. Second, alarms have been sounded about these failures multiple times to little effect. In fact, 2 of our witnesses today, Mr. Slover and Mr. Doherty, even lost their jobs for sounding these alarms. And third, local officials often ignore these problems, and when they do reach out, HUD, which oversees these public housing authorities, often does too little, too late, or sometimes nothing at all to reform these terrible abuses. So today we're here in an attempt to correct some of that and to give a platform to at least 2 former public housing authority employees on why some failing public housing authorities are so resistant to reform. We welcome their testimony, and I hope to see us use it to reinforce what should be an obvious point. If you have a broken public housing authority, one that is mismanaged or even corrupt, there simply is no amount of new money that you can pour into it and expect a different result. It's like pumping gas into a car with a broken engine, or maybe more like pouring whiskey on an alcoholic. You're not going to get anywhere until you fix the underlying problem. Thankfully, there are men like Mr. Slover and Mr. Doherty who are willing to go on record and talk about why we must fix our public housing authorities. And we have congressmen like our colleague, Jeff Van Drew from New Jersey, who reached out to us about the problems in Atlantic City, and frankly, others who've reached out about problems in their areas. They continue to fight for their residents and for the people who are dependent upon a safety net for a time to do what we are paying for, decent, safe, and sanitary housing. And I look forward to this hearing today I look forward to hearing what our whistleblowers have to say and collaborating with our colleagues to address these problems. I yield back. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Cleaver from Missouri, for 4 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the fact that you called this a hearing today. And I would first like to point out that this is a hearing that is very personal to me. I grew up in public housing myself. I know the subject academically and experientially. I understand what it means for a family to have access to housing that is safe, decent, and affordable. HUD assists nearly 5 million households through tenant-based vouchers, project-based subsidies, and the provision of public housing administered through public housing authorities. Public housing has helped stabilize millions of families, including mine, who would otherwise lack access to affordable housing or be forced into homelessness. In the face of a worsening housing supply and affordability crisis, it is more important than ever that we preserve public housing programs. And to be clear, when the housing provided to an American family is either unsafe or indecent, it is unacceptable. 2 months before I was sworn in as mayor of Kansas City, the Housing Authority of Kansas City, Missouri was placed into federal receivership where it stayed for 20 years. It was a terrible, terrible period because we were not in charge of the Housing Authority. And even though the problems occurred under my predecessor, the issue was clear. We had a problem and it wasn't being dealt with. And even receivership made it difficult, contentious, costly, and lengthy. And so I'm very familiar with the challenges public housing authorities face. I would like to conclude by making 2 points. 1.2% of public housing authorities right now, today during this hearing, are troubled. And while there are high-profile cases for the average resident in public housing, it is the chronic underfunding of public housing that is having the largest direct impact on their lives. This includes a capital needs backlog of over $60 billion with a B, but also includes underfunding the agency in a way that, identified by the HUD IG, inhibits the capacity of the agency to deliver on its growing mission and program responsibilities. We should not minimize the impact of budget cuts on the conditions, accessibility, and capacity to properly administer public housing. It is the responsibility of the Public Housing Authority to ensure that their housing programs are properly managed, and the responsibility of HUD to hold public housing authorities accountable. I received an update this morning from the agency on the status of engagement with troubled public housing authorities. We all have understanding concerns. There is a bipartisan agreement that some of the failure we see at the Public Housing Authority is unacceptable. I appreciate that this hearing is asking for the IG to provide and update this subcommittee on the NYCHA. But I think we can do more than take HUD and HUD IG recommendations and drive improvements, and I'm interested in hearing from all the witnesses on how we can support the agency in achieving its mission. I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, for 1 minute for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairman, and to the ranking member for holding this hearing, and thank you to our expert witnesses for appearing before the committee. I agree with my constituents who feel that the rent is too damn high and that our public housing authorities have a vital role to play for 21.6 million American households spending over 30% of their monthly income on rent. These are the vital issues that we need to address today, not only the access to vouchers and landlords who are refusing to accept them, but the impact that it has on veterans, single households led by women predominantly, and families who are trying to get into affordable housing. So I look forward to our full, robust hearing, and I thank the witnesses for being here today.
I thank the gentleman. Today we welcome the testimony of Bill Slover. Mr. Slover is a principal at AVCO Interests and former chairman of the District of Columbia Housing Authority Board. We also welcome Matt Doherty. Mr. Doherty is a former executive director of the Atlantic City Housing Authority. We also welcome Georgi Bana. Mr. Bana is General Counsel and Director of Strategic Initiatives at the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Offices, or NAHRO. We thank each of you for taking time to be here. Each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony without objection. Each of your written statements will be made part of the record. Mr. Slover, you are now recognized for your opening remarks.
Thank you. Chairman Davidson, Ranking Member Cleaver, and members, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the impact failing public housing authorities have on housing access. My name is Bill Slover, and I have over 30 years of experience in public and private sectors. Today, I will focus on my 10 years of service in the DC Housing Authority Board, emphasizing the challenges I faced, the rampant waste, fraud, and abuse I saw, and the recommendations for reform. DCHA's mandate is broad and critical, housing over 18,000 families with an annual budget of $500 million. When I was appointed chairman in 2009, my goal was to increase access to quality housing for DCHA's clients. Immediately recognizing the need for fundamental change, I called for greater accountability, improved operational and financial management. My efforts faced quick resistance, resulting in my swift removal as chair, ending my term without tangible progress. Rejoining the board in 2015 as the advocate representative, one of 2 independent seats on the board, I again pushed for efficiencies, reform, better financial stewardship from a more protected perch. Despite my best efforts, the agency's decline was accelerating. By the fall of 2021, having exhausted all other avenues, I reached out to HUD for help, resulting in a scathing review published in September of 2022, highlighting DCHA's systematic failures through 80-plus findings that left no part of the agency unscathed, validating my concerns. HUD identified 5 principal issues contributing to DCHA's failure: inadequate oversight, poor management, lack of expertise, to name a few. In short, the agency was failing on all fronts. Rather than addressing HUD's findings collaboratively, the mayor and the city's council solution was to disband the independent board that rang the alarm bells, replacing it with 100% of mayoral appointees without a single public hearing. This drastic response removed all independent voices from the board, sending a loud and clear message to anyone and everyone that any attempts to get in the way of the city's agenda would not be tolerated, and that even independent seats on an independent agency's board could be eliminated very easily, leaving little doubt who was in charge. 18 months later, there's no evidence of reform. Recent news highlights continued mismanagement in use of algorithms, of all things, to determine rental rates. The need for decisive intervention has become more acute. Millions of dollars continue to be wasted, and HUD continues slow to cure. Despite my experience, I am still a strong believer in PHAs. The structure is there. We need better leadership. Through PHAs, HUD is the largest owner and operator of multifamily real estate in the country. It is important to remember that HUD does own these public housing units and directly funds housing subsidy payments. And because of that, they have a fiduciary obligation to make sure that PHAs maximize the value of those resources. HUD doesn't seem to understand this. Their hands-off funder approach has failed far too long. How HUD has run its PHAs is nothing short of total failure in far too many instances. It has been allowed to go on for far too long. How long have we been talking about HUD's failures? It's simple math. If a housing agency is inefficient, spending more money on basic operations, fewer people get housed, negatively impacting the entire housing space, costing more money, less production, translation, failure. HUD needs to reform its management of PHAs, as the current process is failing far too often. Absent this, no amount of money pumped into PHAs will result in measurable progress, increased access to housing. Money will not solve what is a failure of execution compounded by a lack of oversight and accountability and leadership. HUD should do three key things before providing any additional funds to PHAs. HUD must revamp its management of PHAs, creating a structure that tracks results and triggers intervention as soon as an agency gets off track. Act like the fiduciary that it is. Change the governance structure. PHA governing bodies need to be held directly accountable to HUD rather than local municipal leaders. HUD is conceding its fiduciary obligations of billions of taxpayer dollars to local governments, which is no way to exercise fiduciary responsibility and has resulted in very poor outcomes. Demand qualified leaders. Until PHAs can execute the basic core functions of running a real estate company, they will continue to underperform. PHAs are complex operating businesses and need to be run as such. I hope my experience can help inform this committee as it considers how to best allocate taxpayer dollars towards our nation's housing challenges. PHAs represent a unique opportunity for the federal government to participate in the housing crisis. Real reform could have a meaningful impact on so many people. We owe it to them to try. We need to take stock in why housing costs are so high and production is so low and begin to make the market corrections needed. HUD needs to be held accountable for the money they deploy. I'll leave one last thing. DCHA is considered a high-performing agency by HUD. And in the report that the HUD did, they indicated that if it weren't considered a high-performing agency, it would be in receivership. I'll just leave you with that. So thank you.
It's an interesting data point. Thank you, Mr. Slover. Mr. Doherty, you're now recognized for your opening remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Davidson and Ranking Member Cleaver, for having me today, along with the other members of the committee. Thank you for allowing the opportunity to present a firsthand account of the corruption and mismanagement I encountered at the Atlantic City Housing Authority, ACHA, which has grievously impacted the lives of the most economically vulnerable Americans. It's critical to acknowledge that ACHA is not just a housing authority, it's also the largest slumlord in Atlantic City. If they were a private concern, they would have been put out of business a long time ago. After my service as mayor in Belmar, New Jersey from 2011 to 2018, and subsequent role as executive director of the New Jersey Casino Reinvestment Development Authority in Atlantic City, I was appointed as the executive director of the ACHA in May of 2023. Unfortunately, I was fired in September of 2023 for exposing the deeply ingrained corruption within the ACH board and its vendors. I witnessed and spoke out against systemic corruption and financial misconduct by the board and its vendors. The leadership under Chair Stephanie Marshall and Treasurer Jeffrey Dorsey has cultivated an environment ripe with corruption that has directly contributed to the degradation of living conditions for the residents. I observed mismanagement involving approximately $7.4 million allocated to no-bid contracts, which brought about very limited improvements. There were instances of invoices being paid for uncompleted work, purchase orders with no contracts or scope of work, contracts that were never bid out, and bids that were rigged, exemplifying a severe disregard for procedural norms regarding procurement. The procurement process at the ACHA violated their own written procurement policy. A simple-to-understand instance involved a $1,200 invoice for the labor to install 3 window air conditioning units under a no-bid contract, which I rejected. The manager who requested the work also refused to approve the invoice because they believed it was fraudulent. Despite this, the board overrode my decision and proceeded with the payment. This corruption has dire consequences for the residents, especially concerning their basic living needs. Over the last 2 winters, ACHA has failed to provide consistent heating and hot water, and we anticipate similar failures in the coming 24-25 winter season. This neglect stems from a misallocation of funds diverted away from essential services to corrupt dealings by the board. Procurement processes have been manipulated to benefit the board members, removing all oversight from the executive director's office. This was structured through the appointment of an external contractor, Jerry Volpe, who was instructed by board resolution to report directly to the board, further enabling their unchecked control over financial transactions. Additionally, the Atlantic City Council, which is supposed to oversee the ACH board, has shown a lack of will to act and hold hearings. I have spoken about the fraudulent activities at the ACHA with various law enforcement officials, including New Jersey State Police, HUD's Office of Inspector General, the FBI, and assistant U.S. attorneys. While I understand and appreciate the need for them to conduct a thorough and comprehensive investigation that supports charges leading to convictions, this process is inherently time-consuming. Given the urgent needs of residents who are suffering under the current management, I strongly recommend that HUD immediately assume control of the board and the management of the authority. Congressman Van Drew has also spoken about this as well. The residents cannot afford to wait for the criminal justice system to take action against the board members. In addition, I would propose a few simple recommendations for HUD that include, first, implement strict oversight mechanisms that empower HUD to audit and, if necessary, remove corrupt housing authority board members and ban vendors who commit fraud. And second, ensure that HUD and its Office of Inspector General have unrestricted access to all housing authority records and communications, such as emails, to facilitate transparency and prevent further abuses. The level of corruption at ACHA is not merely a breach of ethical standards, but a critical failure that inflicts real harm on the community. It is crucial that HUD takes immediate and forceful action to dismantle these corrupt practices and reinstate integrity and effective management at the Atlantic City Housing Authority. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions and the opportunity to assist in any way possible in these reformative efforts.
Thank you, Mr. Doherty. Mr. Bana, you are now recognized for your opening statement.
Chairman Davidson, Ranking Member Cleaver, Ranking Member Waters, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today about the performance of our nation's public housing agencies. My name is Georgi Bana, and I serve as General Counsel and Director of Strategic Initiatives for the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials, NAHRO. NAHRO has worked for over 90 years to ensure that all families have access to safe, secure, affordable housing in strong, resilient communities. In my roles at NAHRO, I've had the pleasure of working with NAHRO's 2,500 member housing agencies and their more than 26,000 incredible housing and community development member officials nationally. NAHRO members administered more than 3 million homes for more than 8 million people. Public housing agencies, PHAs, overwhelmingly administer the public housing and housing choice voucher program successfully and are responsible stewards of federal taxpayer dollars. The public housing assessment system provides a comprehensive evaluation of an agency by measuring their physical, financial, management, and capital fund conditions. HUD's latest data shows that 73% of PHAs receive a high or standard performer designation. Only 5% were designated as troubled. PHAs are local governmental entities that represent the communities that they serve. More than 1.6 million people live in public housing, and more than 5 million people are housed through the Housing Choice Voucher Program. Public housing provides critical housing to families, seniors, and individuals with disabilities, including over 500,000 children. The vast majority, approximately 77% of families receiving housing assistance, earn less than 30% of the area median income. Only 4% of assisted families rely on welfare as a major source of income. PHAs effectively provide housing assistance to millions of Americans despite consistent underfunding of HUD programs. A significant amount of America's current public housing stock was built between the 1950s and the 1970s. In 2010, HUD conducted a national public housing capital needs assessment that determined that the total backlog of public housing capital funding was $26 billion. The report also determined that Congress would need to appropriate $3.4 billion per year to meet all public housing capital needs. But the backlog continued to grow. NAHRO now estimates that the capital fund backlog is over $90 billion. And although capital fund appropriations have increased in recent years, with all-time highs in 2022, they have not once reached the annual capital need amount of $3.4 billion established 14 years ago. Providing adequate annual appropriations is critical to ensuring that aging public housing units remain decent and safe, leading to the long-term sustainability of this essential program. During the recent COVID-19 pandemic, PHA served as invaluable community hubs, providing food, healthcare, and other necessities of daily life. PHAs embraced new technologies and modes of operation to ensure that residents were still well served. Many PHAs quickly and successfully implemented new waivers that provided broad flexibilities and created new processes to ensure that health and safety of their residents. For example, many PHAs did their first remote video inspections and virtual eligibility and annual income examinations that allowed them to safely monitor unit conditions and serve the residents. When provided the appropriate tools and flexibilities to respond to their local community needs, PHAs quickly adapt to ensure their residents are provided critical services. As I conclude, I ask Congress to take the following steps to support the success of PHAs. 1, increase investments in affordable housing programs. Congress should fully fund public housing housing choice vouchers, project-based rental assistance contracts, and community development programs to guarantee that all families have access to safe and secure housing. Second, streamline federal regulations. Although some guardrails are necessary to ensure statutory compliance, they must allow for efficient and cost-effective operation of housing programs so that agencies can better address the unique needs of their community. And finally, demonstrate congressional support for local flexibility. Congress must ensure that housing authorities have the necessary flexibilities to meet local needs effectively, acknowledging the importance of local expertise and community engagement in the affordable housing sector. Thank you again for this opportunity to testify, and I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Bana. Before we proceed to questions, I now recognize the ranking member, Ms. Waters, for 1 minute for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased that we're having this hearing today. I am one who has worked very hard to do everything that we can to improve public housing. As a matter of fact, I have legislation that first showed up in Build Back Better, and I have the Crisis Responsive Act that would provide $65 billion to address the backlog of public housing repairs that threaten residents' lives. We know that when poor people are piled on top of each other with not the proper resources and the deterioration that has taken place, there are going to be problems. And if you would contact me, I'll work with your representative to see what we can do about following up on the concerns. But I do not want to demonize all public housing. As you have said, I guess the larger percentage of them are operating successfully. It is only about 5% that we have these problems with. We should work on correcting them, but not on demonizing them. I'll yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the ranking member. I also ask unanimous consent to read into the record a statement from Representative Van Drew from New Jersey. Without objection, the Atlantic City Housing Authority has failed the people of Atlantic City. The authority has squandered millions of taxpayer dollars through illicit no-bid contracts that failed to deliver any results. Mr. Doherty's testimony is a damning indictment of the illegal practices that left our most vulnerable residents in cold, infested, and moldy apartments. We must ensure that this never happens again. I concur with Mr. Doherty's recommendations for greater oversight and accountability, and that HUD assume control of ACHA. I thank the House Financial Services Committee for working with me to set up today's hearing and shine a light on this appalling crisis. We'll now turn to member questions. The chair now recognize myself for questioning. First of all, I'd like to thank again Mr. Slover, Mr. Doherty for coming before us today. It takes a lot of courage to face down essentially a system or a machine of local government, public housing agencies to get your stories told. We're interested in hearing from both of you in your own words exactly what happened and why. And frankly, thanks for having the moral courage to risk your livelihoods to do the right thing. Mr. Doherty, when you first became aware of the mismanagement problems in the Atlantic City Public Housing Authority, what actions did the local governments take to address the problem, and what was the result?
When I first became aware of it, was really within the first couple of weeks of being there. I simply asked for a list of vendors, and there was no list. I was met one morning by 2 detectives from New Jersey State Police who asked how vendors were being selected. I said I had no idea. I just got there. But when I contacted the chair of the board and let her know that there were 2 detectives from the state police, which is quite alarming when you show up to work, her and the treasurer, Jeffrey Dorsey, called me back, and Mr. Dorsey informed me that I don't talk to the police. And that's when I knew that the authority was heading in the wrong direction.
When did things get bad enough that HUD became involved?
HUD became involved when I started sending them purchase orders. I sent them one purchase order that had no contract, was never bid, for $200,000 that had no scope of work. It was not done during any emergency period. I sent it to them, and it literally went into a black hole. I followed up, and they said, we will be asking for additional information, and nothing ever came of it.
Do you think they would have even done that if you hadn't pressed the matter?
No.
Yeah, that's disappointing. You know, Mr. Slover, as you were pointing out that the DC Public Housing Authority gets a passing grade and higher praise than that by HUD, it sort of reminds me of a school system where you know, everyone gets an A. Or, you know, you can pass people on to the next grade because they're proficient in math or reading, and then when they graduate, they can't read or do math. I think that's the concern with a lot of DC public housing authorities, and I just wonder, you know, I sent a letter in December to HUD Secretary Fudge on what I called the, quote, unacceptable and inhumane conditions of the DC Public Housing Authority. Public housing authorities do have this obligation under law to provide, quote, decent, safe, and sanitary housing. So it's not debatable. Why do you think public housing authorities in HUD are not upholding the law?
That's a great question. It is hard to understand what the answer to that could be because we basically have 6,000 plus public housing units left in the District of Columbia. I think everybody wants to talk about how housing authorities are underfunded. I think that's the continued sort of comment, underfunded, underfunded, underfunded. Well, my point is when you're wasting millions and millions and millions of dollars. As an example, the capital budget for DC Housing Authority is $32 million. The amount of money that makes it to capital projects was $2 million 1 year. Because all the money gets scraped away. It gets used for pet projects, for the police force, for other things. And so it's gross mismanagement and failure to understand what the mission of the agency is and being dragged by local jurisdictions who want a different outcome. They're not so interested in 0 to 30% of area mean income. They're interested in supporting their own housing desires, but they don't have the resources to do it, so they use the local agency to do it. And what doesn't get served is the clients and residents of public housing. They become a secondary thought.
Yeah, thank you. And I think the number of unused, unoccupied, you know, units here in DC really sounds the alarm. I think the other thing we didn't mention is the voucher system, because the public housing system wasn't working as well. So we've got areas that have used some of these very effectively, and even that system has failed. But I just can't stop with thinking about 70 current former employees of NYCHA, single largest public housing authority in the nation, arrested in a massive federal sting operation. The charges involve more than $2 million in bribes taken over 10 years, nearly 1/3 of NYCHA's developments. The New York Times called it, quote, the largest number of federal bribery charges the DOJ has ever handled in a single day. These arrests followed the conviction of 12 vendors who pled guilty in 2021 to paying bribes to NYCHA employees. If you look at the reporting on this, we need to give far more attention to it. I look forward to the future testimony of our inspectors general. And I now yield 5 minutes to the ranking member from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, for 5 minutes.
I want to make sure that I'm clear and there's no ambiguity in what I say. If somebody is stealing money, they ought to go to jail. I don't care if it's public housing or public bathrooms, they go to jail. But I think that, I mean, I'm always, and I said to myself this morning in the shower, I was not going to take anything on a personal level because I lived in public housing, and then I ran a public housing, at least for 2 months before I went into receivership. But I know how it runs and I know how it operates, and I don't think anybody that I know is going to say, well, let's keep the corruption going in public housing. Nobody's going to say that. But let me also be clear. Funding does matter, and for us to suggest that funding doesn't matter, it just doesn't compute. Because if housing is collapsing in, and there are problems in public housing that can't be fixed otherwise, those problems do exist. I mean, I don't think anybody living in public housing got equipment when they started knocking down walls and tearing up furnaces. Those things get old and they have to be replaced, and they often are not replaced because there is not enough money. I'm not telling you what I heard, I'm not telling you what I read in a sociology book, I'm telling you what I've seen and experienced. I lived in 405 Unit B, 7 years, and the people who lived there wanted to live under the best circumstances they could. because that's what we want to do in our country. And so right now, Mr. Bana, what tools do we have in HUD that you're aware to deal with these issues?
Thank you for the question, Ranking Member. There are mechanisms in place for oversight of housing authorities. There is the Public Housing Assessment System, which does evaluate housing authorities at various levels and provides a score. It does look at the condition of the properties. It looks at their financial condition, their management condition, and then their capital fund conditions. And those mechanisms are in place, and agencies receive scores on generally an annual basis. And based on those scores, continued and additional oversight, if necessary, is provided by HUD. So there are mechanisms in place that currently do provide that oversight from the HUD level to the local housing authority.
So, Mr. Doherty, so I'm assuming that the problems you noticed, or that there were in your community with public housing, that there was, once it was brought to the attention of officials, that the proper law enforcement agencies were brought in, and that any other problems existing in public housing in terms of how people lived, that was also addressed.
Thank you for the question. Law enforcement was brought in, but what's unfortunately happened is while law enforcement is actively seeking evidence to prosecute, at the same time, people are suffering. So, if HUD OIG could communicate with HUD and say, look, we have an active investigation and we think this is going somewhere, that should trigger something in HUD to say, all right, let's take a look at this authority and take it over so that people no longer have to suffer through terrible living conditions. I'll give you one example. Last year, because the procurement process was so terrible, there was no extermination for roaches and mice for about 7 weeks during the summer. Now, if you've lived in public housing and you don't exterminate for that long, particularly in the summer months, you know that you're gonna get a terrible infestation. And there were people living in those conditions. Young families, seniors, children living in deplorable conditions because the procurement was so inadequate and was done improperly. Again, law enforcement is involved and they should be involved, but I think it's time that HUD takes it over and improves the conditions of the...
With what money?
Pardon me?
You said it would be time for HUD to take it over. With what money?
Well, I would say HUD should take over the governance of the board. Which,
I know, okay. So with what money?
well, sir, the board is
I
volunteer.
pointed to the board, I know how it is. I want to know what money is going to be used to make the improvements necessary.
I don't have an answer to that question, sir.
I know you, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So, gentlemen, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I want to talk about City of Milwaukee. HUD reports in December of 2022 and April of 2023 showed the Housing Authority of the City of Milwaukee was at risk for fraud and abuse and allegedly mismanaged millions of dollars. In May of 2023, that may be some of the dollars we were just talking about, HUD deemed some of the Housing Authority's programs, including its Section 8 program, quote-unquote troubled. In recent years, residents have come forward and expressed complaints about bed bugs, rat infestations, apartment break-ins, and mold. For its financial conditions, the Housing Authority scored 0 of 25 points. The physical conditions of its properties, too, received a poor grade, scoring just 26 of 40 points. HUD recently ordered the Housing Authority to hire an outside agency, the Department of Neighborhood Services, to run inspections of the Housing Authority's more than 4,000 units. HUD also ordered the Housing Authority to bring an outside vendor to help the Section 8 office go through every single participant in the Housing Choice Voucher Program and make corrections if needed. While leaving the Housing Authority as the administrator, which is key in this discussion, I think. After that, DNS had the ability to fine and hold the housing authority of the city of Milwaukee accountable. Mr. Slover, Mr. Doherty, you've both mentioned so far today kind of a need for more direct accountability to HUD. So let me ask you first, Mr. Slover, should HUD have stepped in? Is this a situation where HUD should have stepped in the Milwaukee situation sooner? And is this typically what you see in other larger metropolitan areas?
No, absolutely. HUD needs a quicker trigger. They wait way too long, and by the time they get there, the damage is so bad that it's really hard to unwind, and then they don't even do it then.
Very good. Mr. Doherty, would conditions that I just described in Milwaukee be more likely to be improved if the authority or its vendor were held accountable directly to HUD?
No, if there was more accountability and more enforcement, I think you'd see improved living conditions for the residents in public housing.
And then the question to both of you, how can Congress, how can those of us sitting in this room right now kind of refocus the accountability of public housing agencies to HUD for greater accountability for tracking and the reporting and the achieving results? Because what I think many members of Congress find frustrating is this problem is so massive kind of across the country right now. It's hard to figure out what can we do to specifically kind of target something.
I'll take a shot at that. So there's 3,000 public housing agencies in the country. It's the largest real estate operating business in the country. The largest private landlord is you. You're right there. But you don't run it that way. You run it as if, you're sending money and don't really care what happens. I don't want to say care, but there is no demand for a return on the investment. There's plenty of models out there. There's franchise models, there's business models, there's many models of accountability. When someone checks into the Days Inn in Austin, Texas, they know how much that room rate was, and they know what their profit was. The technology exists. This government and this agency and HUD doesn't want to know that level of information, because then we have to really start. Accountability is a really difficult thing, and it's going to be a very difficult road, but we have to start because the results are just ineffective. Again, it's not a money problem; it's an execution problem. There's a saying out there: 20% idea, 80% execution. We don't have any execution capacity within this vast enterprise.
Very good. Mr. Doherty, do you have a comment on that front?
I think Bill handled that really well, so I don't want to add to it.
Very good. Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the ranking member from California, Ms. Waters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I would like to direct this question to Mr. Doherty. You were the mayor. Did you have an appointment to the board when you were mayor?
Yes, ma'am.
How many appointments did you have?
Just to be clear, I was mayor of my town in Belmar, but I served as the executive director for the Atlantic City Housing Authority. When I was mayor in Belmar, I had one appointment to the board.
You had how many appointments?
One appointment as the mayor.
One appointment. And so who selects the head of the housing authority? What is your understanding of how one gets to be the director, the head of the housing authority, of a housing authority?
Yes, ma'am. So in New Jersey, under state statute, every housing authority has 7 members. 5 are chosen from the council, 1 from the mayor, and 1 from Department of Community Affairs, which ultimately is the governor.
And how is the executive director?
Those 7 do a search for an executive director, and the board appoints an executive director by resolution.
Does the mayor have any responsibility in that appointment at all? Is the city council involved with that appointment, or is it simply done by the board of the housing authority?
By the board of the housing authority.
And so, knowing what you know, would you propose to change the way the makeup of the board takes place and involve the city council and the mayors more?
No, the mayor and council only appoint the board, and they have oversight over the board as well.
I beg your pardon?
The council appoints 5 members of the board, and they have oversight for the board.
Okay,
They can
so
hold
that is
hearings.
the city council.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so tell me, when you were mayor, what you did working with the city council to deal with the issues that you're bringing here today.
Well, again, ma'am, when I was mayor in Belmar, we had a very small housing authority, only 46 units, all seniors. I was the executive director at the Atlantic City Housing Authority, two completely different towns.
Okay, that's different, but even when you were mayor, what did you do in this small town, working with the city council and the mayor about the oversight of public housing?
Fortunately, in Belmar, we had a very well-run public housing authority. There was minimal oversight. We worked together. They were not in a troubled status. They performed well.
And so, because that was well-run, and having been the executive director of another, you saw the difference.
Yes, ma'am.
And the difference that you saw have been discussed with, worked with the mayor and the city council?
Everything has been brought up to the mayor and city council. Yes, ma'am.
Well, not just brought up, but the city council has a vote, and they have some authority, and they have some responsibility. What did you do working with the city council, the elected officials, about the problems of the housing authority that you were executive director of?
I both spoke privately and publicly at a Atlantic City Council meeting and asked them to hold hearings, and they have refused.
Did they hold the hearings?
No, ma'am.
And so when they did not hold the hearings, what did you do?
I kept pushing as much as I could. I talked with the congressman who represents Atlantic City, Jeff Van Drew. I reached out to our United States senators, including Bob Menendez, who himself has also called for HUD to take over the Atlantic City Housing Authority. And now I'm here in front of you today, ma'am.
Given the knowledge, both from a mayor's standpoint and from executive director standpoint, what do you advocate in terms of helping to get better oversight and supervision? What's your advice?
Well, on a micro scale, when it comes to the Atlantic City Housing Authority, I advocate for HUD to take over the board and management of the authority immediately. And on a grander scale, for HUD to have more oversight and also to have more authority into housing authorities. So one of the things I've learned through this process, which was quite eye-opening and makes no sense to me, is that HUD, including HUD Officer and Inspector General, have no authority to look at emails on housing authority servers. These housing authority servers are paid for by HUD with federal dollars, and they are not granted access to those email servers.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentlewoman. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Housing affordability is a serious crisis in our nation right now. We are well over 6.5 million units underbuilt at the moment, with mortgage rates at multi-decade highs, limited supply, and continued supply chain and construction issues. For many, it is the most difficult time to purchase a home in a generation. These, among other factors, have forced many potential home buyers into the rental market, driving up rental demand and prices with it. This topic is critical, which is why we need to be working together as elected officials, government agencies, nonprofit organizations, local stakeholders, and key figures from industries like real estate, development and construction, and insurance. At such a crucial time, with so many families struggling to get by, so many vulnerable and low-income Americans are relying on access to decent, safe, and sanitary housing from public housing authorities. The New York City Housing Authority, NYCHA, is by far the largest public housing authority in the nation, consisting of almost 180,000 apartments. As such, it received over $2.8 billion of federal funding in 2023 through a range of different federal programs. Yet despite the funding and all the money poured in from the state and local sources, NYCHA has exhibited a complete and total failure to adequately house New Yorkers. Go to many of these locations or read the reports from advocates about the horrific conditions of many of the authority's units. Reports about mold, apartments freezing cold during winter and scorching hot during summer, infestations of pets and rodents, and a host of life-threatening safety violations. Meanwhile, as the chairman alluded to, NYCHA just saw the largest number of federal bribery charges the DOJ had ever handed out in a single day, resulting from millions in bribes. This from a housing authority that already has a federal monitor, resulting from their failure to adequately do their job. While NYCHA may be arguably the biggest and baddest offender, these issues are reflected nationally in public housing authorities. Mr. Slover, HUD is the federal agency tasked by statute with funding and overseeing public housing agencies and has many tools to conduct supervisory and enforcement actions. Do you believe HUD was properly overseeing DCHA or responsive to issues that have been known and reported on for many years, even prior to the audit report?
Well, actually, I'm the one who had to call HUD because I spent over 3 or 4 years elevating issues, getting the board to discuss them, getting articles written in the Washington Post and every other newspaper in the city. I finally reached out to HUD and basically begged them to come in. They came in the 9 months to issue their report, and again, a year and a half later, there's no meaningful reform at the agency, and again, it's still considered a high-performing agency. Again, it absolutely fundamentally makes zero sense that an agency that has a 25% vacancy rate, 25% collection rate, they have a vacancy of 25%.
In your opinion, are there additional authorities or tools that Congress should consider in order to compel HUD to act sooner and more effectively with respect to troubled PHAs?
Well, I think the problem, as I articulated in my testimony, is that HUD doesn't consider themselves a fiduciary. We keep talking about oversight. This is not an oversight matter. This is management. Oversight would lead you to believe that they're just there to make sure everything's okay. This is an operating business. I don't think the government runs any other operating business. Maybe the U.S. Mint. They make money, they sell it, right? This is an operating business. That's the thing that I don't think is resonating here. And so it's almost like you have to, I hate to use the word authority to manage an authority problem, but it's almost like you have to take these public housing agencies out of HUD, spin them out into something that has accountability. Its own P&L. If I'm going to give you X billion dollars, I want to see what the result is. We don't have that today. We have the technology, we have the ability, but there's nobody who wants that information, apparently. Everybody wants to talk about housing affordability. We're not even talking about affordable housing here. We're talking about subsidized housing. There's very different things. We can't even get our subsidized housing correct. Imagine what affordable housing problems we have. We can't do subsidized.
To that end, can you just briefly, in the time I have left, share some examples of how families living in housing provided by DCHA have been impacted from a health and safety perspective?
I'm currently a receiver for the DC Superior Courts. I have 1,000 units in Washington, D.C. I run through receivership. The D.C. Housing Authority properties are all, without question, in worse condition. The business is not run well. Capital budgets aren't spent well. We overspend on the voucher program. We do everything possible we can to not manage this process.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member. As a country, the National Multifamily Housing Council estimates that we need to build an astounding 4.3 million new apartment units in the next 10 years to keep up with demand. That is only to keep up. Even at that pace, we wouldn't even begin to deal with the shortfall that renters face today. And yet, in the face of this daunting challenge, our public housing authorities remain dedicated to expanding affordable housing resources to all who need it. Now, I understand that the other side might want to focus on what doesn't work, but I'd like to focus on what does and use it as a model for replication. The Nevada Rural Housing Authority has been using unique public-private partnerships to bring safe, clean, and affordable apartments to portions of the state in rural Nevada that have faced decades of neglect. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a Moapa Valley Progress article from April 30th titled Grand Opening of Hafen Village.
Without objection.
Also, I'd like to share one of the residents' experience, June Jones, who moved into a one-bedroom apartment at Hafen Village. She said, it is so peaceful here and quiet. I don't have to worry about traffic or crime or overcrowding. I'm just so glad to be here. This is part of a 96-unit project, the largest to date to be built by the Nevada Rural Housing Authority. It offers 1, 2, and 3-bedroom units ranging from 680 square feet to over 1,100 square feet. The units feature patios and balconies, attractive kitchens and baths, beautiful flooring, extra storage space, and air conditioning. The common spaces offer picnic areas, a dog park, a community garden, children's playground, computer lab, library, laundry room, fitness facility, and an entertainment space with kitchen. It's not just an apartment, it's a home. It's a home with dignity, and they've done it the right way. It was only made possible, though, through years of work by our state's housing authority, community banks, developers, various nonprofits, and essential funding from the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco. It was their shared commitment to providing rural Nevadans an affordable and safe place to call home that made this partnership work. This is who we should have testifying today. Mr. Bana, as we have had consistently inadequate funding at the federal level to increase the construction of affordable housing, we have seen an increase in PHAs that are turning to innovative and new partnerships to serve their residents. In your experience, how can effective partnerships, both with private developers and local municipalities, maximize a public housing authority's ability to deliver new affordable units in the face of continued funding cuts?
Thank you, Representative Horsberg. Excellent question. I think housing authorities are a key partner in many housing developments to, again, tackle that lack of housing supply that we have now. We need all hands on deck, more partners, more cooperation. Also, by housing authorities being part of that partnership and local communities, private industry, additional resources do come to the table through those partnerships. And then working with the public side of the partnership as well, there are other advantages at the local level as well.
Thank you.
This is a time for all to be at the table so that we can tackle the lack of housing supply.
Thank you very much. It's great to know that our public housing authorities are able to do what's necessary to carry out their vital mission. However, public-private partnerships do come with their own challenges, namely an inherent lack of transparency and accessibility surrounding data collection. Tenants searching for affordability periods of specific buildings within the low-income housing tax credit program have nowhere to look, as no centralized public database exists presently. This means that tenants could be unaware of impending rent increases until they are notified by their management. That is why today I'm introducing, along with the ranking member, Mr. Cleaver, the Housing Market Transparency Act to allow the collection and consolidation of critical data such as habitability standards, recent inspection information, ownership status, development cost, and more. We all know we have an affordability housing crisis in this country, but the only way to understand the magnitude of the crisis is to get a holistic view of our current affordable housing stock. By centralizing this information at HUD, researchers, regulators, advocates, and administrators will be able to make affordable housing development programs more efficient and keep tenants well-informed. That should be at the center of our housing policy. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Garbarino, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thanks to the ranking member for having this hearing, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. I will say there are housing authorities. Some of them are very, very well run. We have a couple on Long Island, where I'm from, a couple in my district that have done a great job. But we also have some that have issues. Specifically, I want to talk about the latest scandal that hit New York City's housing authority, NYCHA, led to 70 current and former NYCHA superintendents and staff being arrested for allegedly pocketing bribes in exchange for granting no bid or micro-contract repair work. This 10-year, $2 million classic pay-for-play corruption scheme was the largest number of federal bribery arrests brought in a single day in DOJ history, and included public housing employees at developments in every borough. Fortunately, we've seen consistent examples of waste, fraud, and abuse at many other housing authorities across the country, ranging from multiple NYCHA examples to the FBI's years-long investigation of missing and unallocated funds of the Little Rock Public Housing Authority. So Doherty, to speak more generally, why do these types of problems appear to be so widespread and persistent for so long?
Thank you for the question. I could tell you that well-run housing authorities far outnumber poorly run housing authorities. But housing authorities should be well-run. It's serving the most vulnerable population in this country. And it's such a basic need to have decent, clean, healthy housing. So what I'm really here to highlight is the Atlantic City Housing Authority. Next door to us is the Pleasantville Housing Authority. It runs great. There's no reason why a housing authority shouldn't run well, no matter what the scale, whether it's the smallest one or the largest one. They all should be running well. And if they're not, that's when HUD should either exercise its ability to take it over while law enforcement is researching and prosecuting corrupt practices. But the focus really needs to stay on the residents that are supposed to be served by the housing authorities. So again, I would, just to reiterate, housing authorities should be running well. Most of them are. The real focus needs to be on the ones that are not, because it's residents that are suffering because of it.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I mean, a lot of them do run well, and my previous life as an attorney, my firm represented a housing authority, and the smaller ones seem to run great. But we've had, like in New York City Housing Authority, with thousands and thousands and thousands of people. Unfortunately, it's usually the residents that are being hurt by all the corruption that happens there. Following the NYCHA incident, Department of Investigations released more than a dozen recommendations for the Housing Authority to implement. Of those recommendations, 3 were repeat recommendations from a 2021 incident in which 9 contractors were charged with bribery following another scheme that took advantage of the micro-contract process. The recommendations including shifting responsibility for approving micro-contracts to NYCHA's centralized staff instead of building superintendents, as well as identifying cost estimates for common, repeat, no-bid repair jobs, making it easier to spot pricing anomalies. However, NYCHA ultimately rejected these recommendations and appeared to continue with its ways. Mr. Slover and Doherty, in your opinion, what can be done, and you touched a little bit, Mr. Doherty, in your license, what can be done to hold public housing authorities, especially repeat offenders, more accountable for failures to make meaningful reforms? And I know, Mr. Doherty, you just said HUD could take over for a little bit, but what other ideas are there?
Well, I just think it's a repeat theme, which is there has to be some sort of expectation and accountability to the money from the beginning. In other words, HUD shouldn't be coming in and going, oh my God, something happened here. They should know on a day-to-day basis what their money is being used for and whether they're being successful, so you can course correct midstream versus 2 or 3 years after the fact. So if HUD is still making recommendations to NYCHA after all we've read about NYCHA for the last 3 years, don't you think that's a little bit odd? Like, they shouldn't be making recommendations anymore because clearly they're not listening.
So what do we? So here's the question: that I mean, the governance structure. How do we change? I mean, how do you change the governance structure?
Well, you change the governance structure by saying you don't report to the mayor, to the council, to whomever. It's not their money. It's HUD's money. HUD has HUD is doing to 0 to 30% of area mean income. Local jurisdictions typically don't do that work. That's 0 to 30% is what the federal dollars are for. So they should be focusing 100% of their attention on that. And so, again, it needs to be an operating business that reports to HUD, not to a local board.
I yield back. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank the gentleman. The gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. I want the record to reflect that under this Republican majority, the 118th Congress, colleagues across the aisle have been trying to defund climate investments, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and now public housing. I'm not sure what they actually want to fund. Public housing is a lifeline for millions of families, especially our elders, people living with disabilities, working families with children. And in many communities, there is no other source of housing more affordable or readily available to low-income households than public housing. And that is important to recognize. Being low income, being poor is certainly not a character flaw. Being poor is the hardest job you'll ever have. Has nothing to do with work ethic or character. It's usually because of broken systems and short-sighted or failed policies. Everyone is deserving of more than just shelter or housing. They're deserving of a home, a place that when you open the door, you feel a sense of belonging and refuge and safety away from the pressures of the world. The chronic underfunding of public housing is a disgrace to our values, and it has real consequences. I have constituents in my district, the Massachusetts 7th, living in households with backed up raw sewage, rat infestations, dark hallways with broken lights. A father recently explained to me how black mold in his apartment endangered and actually resulted in his child having severe asthma, so much so that they would rather sleep in their car instead of in their apartment. This is shameful, and it is preventable. This committee can and should and must take decisive action on improving the quantity and quality of public housing. Mr. Bana, from your perspective, why haven't we seen the investments that we need to address the housing crisis?
The investment is needed. It is critical for both the preservation and for the development of new units. I think there's a choice has been made and decision is made to, again, with limited resources, fund where those funds will go. I think there does need, with housing, the housing crisis that we have, the lack of affordable units that are currently in the system, there is a need to focus on affordable housing and reinvest into affordable housing. So again, that all Americans may have that home that you mentioned. So I think it is critical that we focus and one, to preserve the hard units, the hard local units that are locally owned units.
Thank you.
And to develop new units.
Thank you. Massachusetts is the third most expensive state to live in across the United States. We have over 180,000 people on a wait list for subsidized apartments, and yet thousands of units remain empty. The primary reason for this is chronic underfunding, which has delayed repair, renovation, and the hiring of necessary staff. Mr. Bana, given the many problems with public housing and the thousands-long wait list, can you outline how families are impacted when both HUD and public housing authorities are chronically underfunded?
An example in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, approximately only 1 in 4 eligible families receive a housing voucher to be used in the private market. The limited resources, lead to longer waiting lists, both in the public housing and the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And again, without the resources to provide and develop new units, the waiting lists only grow longer, and that directly affects our residents and families.
I want to just also say, since housing is not only about health outcomes and economic and social mobility, but it is about dignity. And when you walk into a space that is eroding in real time around you, it takes a toll on your psychological well-being. You feel invisible and that your government doesn't think you're worth investing in. So this is also about dignity. Many public housing authorities have turned to the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program in the face of congressional inaction. This program converts public housing units into privately managed Section 8 housing. Roughly 10% of our public housing stock nationwide has been converted through RAD, often taking place with little government oversight. Instead of compromise programs like RAD, we have to ensure that HUD and public housing authorities have the funding and the staffing they need to repair and renovate public housing while ensuring the health and safety of public housing residents. Thank you, and I yield.
I thank the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Flood, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start by thanking our witnesses for your testimony today. The cases of the D.C. and the Atlantic City housing authorities are deeply disturbing, and I have a number of questions on how Congress can best prevent cases like this from happening again. Mr. Slover and Mr. Doherty, please help me clarify, what authority does HUD have to intervene and address malpractice and fraud at public housing authorities? And specifically, what tools do they have at their disposal to make changes at individual PHAs?
HUD does have the ability to take over a housing authority. It did it recently in Irvington, New Jersey, where they disbanded the board, took over complete management, terminated the executive director, and put it into receivership to turn that housing authority around. So it does have the ability to do it. It just seems as though the process to get there seems longer than it should be. And until they get to that point of taking over and putting in a receivership, the residents continue to suffer on a regular basis. So there is a mechanism there. It's, as Bill mentioned before, pulling the trigger sooner to take over the housing authority.
Mr. Slover?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, the DC Housing Authority was taken into receivership about 20, 25 years ago through court, through DC Superior Court, came out of receivership and was basically put back on the same trajectory again because the board that is now running the agency is fully controlled, is majority controlled by the mayor. And so again, I keep elevating it back to the same place, which is that without lines of accountability, without an understanding that, HUD, PHAs are a subsidiary of HUD, not a adjunct development company for a city. In other words, the cities take advantage of it, use it for their disposal versus what HUD's mandate is, getting away from the 0 to 30% of area mean income. And so HUD needs to run PHAs as if they are the owner and operator of those businesses. That's not what they do today, and the results are what you get. That's why I'm talking about funding. We don't know if funding is the problem, because just at the DC Housing Authority, I watched millions and millions and millions of dollars wasted on contracts, consulting fees, this, that, and the other thing. We have no idea what it costs to run that business.
If you could go back and wave a wand at the DC Housing Authority, what should have HUD done, when and how fast, how extreme?
I mean, they should have come in as soon as, so there's basic metrics of occupancy and rent collection. Those are the two easiest things to monitor. As soon as they went below 90%, they should have come in. We went down to 70%, and they still haven't come in.
And do what?
They got to come in and say, why is the occupancy low? Why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? Put them on a PIP, a performance improvement plan.
Do those work?
In the private sector, they do. I mean, the private sector comes in and they don't tolerate mismanagement because, the money walks. And so the problem with this business is it's the biggest subscription business in the world. The money just keeps coming in, and the results don't happen, and the money keeps coming. And so what is the compelling reason to improve?
Can HUD come in and fire people and assume control?
Well, that's the thing, is HUD owns this business. Again, getting back to my testimony, which is to say, it needs a complete reorganization. Right now, it's a local jurisdiction issue, the local board this, the independent that. It's not working on enough places that
I appreciate
it's impacting.
that. There's one more question I want both of you to answer, and that is, you were both fired from your positions after reporting examples of mismanagement, fraud, and corruption. Are there any relevant whistleblower protections for people working in PHAs? Is that something Congress should consider, Mr. Doherty?
There's no protections that I know of, but I would imagine, yes, that's something that Congress certainly should consider.
Mr. Sloan?
Absolutely. I mean, the mayor, through emergency legislation, reconstituted the board and removed my independent seat. This is an independent agency that she's not supposed to have control of. And yet, they were able, within 2 weeks, remove my seat. So that's not an independent board.
Thank you both for your testimony. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you both, all three of you, for being here, and thank you, Chair, for this important hearing. So I want to start off, and I know some maybe have brought this up, but you know, the PHAs are, it's an understatement, are facing, you know, decades of underinvestment. Do you have any idea how much underinvestment we're talking about, Mr. Bana?
Thank you for the question. NAHRO does estimate that the current capital fund backlog is over $90 billion.
Yeah, it's 60 to 90 billion, those are the amounts. Did you know that, Mr. Doherty?
Yeah, I would imagine that it is severely underfunded, which was also what made it more frustrating for me.
Yeah.
Because we had limited resources.
Sure.
So to see those resources not going to benefit the residents made it even that more challenging.
Well, in terms of oversight and accountability, while our witnesses' testimony discussed the important role of HUD, HUD's OIG, PHA boards play an oversight, there is one group that has not received as much attention, and those are the PHA residents and voucher holders themselves. Today, the public housing assessment scoring system is based on 4 categories: physical conditions, financial conditions, management operations, and capital fund usage. Until 2011, the public housing assessment system also included an additional category, which was the resident assessment subsystem, or what they call, I think, RAS. Is that correct? Are you guys familiar, all 3 of you? Are you familiar? Just nod. That's fine. Okay. You're not familiar with it, Mr. Doherty? No. Okay. This category assessed resident satisfaction, whether or not they were satisfied in a number of areas, including maintenance and repairs, communications, safety, services, and housing property appearance. Should HUD bring back a resident assessment category, and if so, are there any changes, and Mr. Bana, we'll start with you, would make it, or its weighting and overall in PHA scores?
There currently is a resident component to generally the boards. Board membership, there's usually a resident commissioner at agencies as well.
So they have no input, the residents?
On the FAS system, the RAS, the resident subsystem, currently is not part of that. The management and through occupancy is occupants potential is one way that the residents can speak. Again, if the units are not occupied, is one way of having the resident input. But housing authorities regularly, hold their public meetings. Generally, a lot of times.
Yeah, no, but I mean, but do they get any input in scoring?
Not at this time.
No.
Not directly.
And last year, HUD updated its physical inspection process with the new national standards for physical inspection of real estate system. As part of the so-called, what is it, NSPIRE? Is that, there's so many acronyms. Process, residents can add up to 5 units to the inspection list. The process also includes a very brief survey, right? However, the resident selected units are not necessarily included in the inspection score, and the resident survey is not factored into the score at all. I think this is a really big missed opportunity here. So to all the witnesses, should the current NSPIRE process factor resident assessments into physical inspection score? Bill?
I 100% agree that tenant feedback, client feedback is one of the most critical elements. I mean, I was the
That's what we're serving, right?
I was the advocate representative on the board for 7 years. I represented the tenants. That was my
It's helpful.
job.
How about you, Matt?
You're 100% right, and I would tell you, I think the residents in Atlantic City Housing Authority would tell you that they don't voice their opinion anymore because no one cares.
Yeah. How about you, Mr.? Because, this quasi-governmental authority thing, we do it with water now, we do it with housing, we've been doing it for the housing, and I'm being honest, it's like a step removed from the actual resident being able to have any real say about their quality of life or their housing.
The resident units are an addition to the NSPIRE system. They were not in the former system. So that is an improvement to have additional input from the residents and so the residents can actually be part of the inspection process that they weren't necessarily part of previously.
Yeah, I just, to all my colleagues, not many of us are here, but I really think this is a very important factor because there's a saying we say in Detroit, mayors come and go, but neighborhoods and community don't go anywhere. We're still there. And it's like we have no real say or input or any kind of a sense of really self-determination of what that we consider quality. That was the whole point of creating housing commissions. But now, again, there doesn't seem to be a direct accountability for our residents on those PHAs. Thank you so much, I yield.
Thank the gentlewoman. The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. De La Cruz, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing before us. Today's hearing is simple. Our nation's public housing agencies serve a critical function. We've talked about that. I've heard that from the reps over and over. But ensuring access to housing for those that qualify for it starts first with proper oversight and transparency at HUD. It also is a critical step to ensure that we are being good stewards of our tax dollars. That's why I introduced H.R. 7280, the HUD Transparency Act, which was reported favorably out of this committee with a bipartisan 50-0 vote. This is not a partisan issue, and transparency at HUD goes hand in hand with HUD's ability to achieve its stated goals, which for the public housing program is to provide a decent and safe rental housing for eligible low-income families, elderly, and persons with disabilities. That being said, for today's witnesses, just how critical proper oversight and accountability is at HUD and at local PHAs, and unfortunately how there seems to be a vacuum of that leadership. Mr. Slover, you said something that stuck with me in response to the internal backlash you received at the DC Housing Authority. This backlash was for simply requesting an audit, I might add. You stated, and I quote in part, "That's my job. I have a fiduciary responsibility to oversight. If I see something wrong, I have to say something." In addition to a fiduciary responsibility, did you feel that requesting an audit was also in the best interest of the residents, many of who are elderly, that DCHA serves?
100%. I think the purpose of the audit was to sort of ferret out the mismanagement. And so the mismanagement is really what results in poor conditions. So as soon as somebody sees something in poor condition, they say, we need more money. Well, maybe somebody should step back and say, well, how did it get to these poor conditions? Well, it was so poorly managed that if we need to manage it, so management is critical. So that was the purpose of the audit, to come in and from a top to bottom analysis.
Now, did that same audit that you request find that there were more than 80 deficiencies at DCHA?
There were 80, but I would offer to you that it was a scratch of the surface. You know, I was more surprised at what wasn't in the report than what was.
Very interesting. So it's, it is clear that, why do you think there was so much internal opposition to this audit?
Well, you have to understand, if you take a look at the construct of Justice Against the DC Housing Authority Board, you have people on that board who are basically making money off of the enterprise in one way or another. They're for a mayoral appointee, they're there to push favors. Nobody, I don't want to say nobody, but it didn't seem that anybody was there who understood that their job was to work for the authority, not for somebody who put them on that board. And that's the problem with these boards, is people are there for the wrong reason. They don't understand who their boss is. The boss is the agency, their client is the resident. That's it. At the end of the day, all your decisions need to be made on how to improve the enterprise, not what you can get out of it.
So it almost seems like it's a culture within the agency. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the money and where it goes, I mean, we had a scandal with the chairman of the board who drove a $4.5 million contract to his girlfriend. Like, everybody knew it. And so it just goes on and on and on. I mean, you know, DC is a unicameral form of government. There's only one party. So we're in a government that has very few checks and balances. And so the result is we're all part of the same fraternity. Let's do our thing.
Well, leadership always starts at the top, and you see the result of leadership all the way down, and that's what you're clearly stating here. I only have a couple more seconds to go. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time. I yield back.
I'd like to thank our witnesses for their testimony today, and as we talk so much about DC Public Housing Authority, I would just, Ranking Member and I were pointing out that the current acting secretary at HUD is a former director of DC Public Housing Authority. So I think your testimony is incredibly important. I hope it rallies our committee to address these problems. Without objection, I ask that all members have 5 legislative days with which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chairman, which will be forwarded to witnesses for their response. If forwarded, I ask our witnesses to please respond promptly as you are able. This hearing is now adjourned.